paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today, my guest is Joe McMoneagle. Joe is an internationally renowned as a master of remote viewing, and he's also the author of 4 books on remote viewing, including the Memoirs of a Psychic Spy. He was a psychic spy for the U.S. military and participated in the military's Project Stargate. He has also successfully demonstrated his abilities as a psychic and remote viewer under strict scientific control in various labs and on National Geographic, Discovery Channel, BBC, ABC, CBS, and NBC, and also Fox. Good to be with you, Joe.
Hey, finally. Sorry about the technical difficulties.
Joe and I had some technical difficulties, but right now we're locked in. So, Joe, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I did 20 years in the Army. I was in intelligence. Let's see, I spent almost 14 years overseas doing an active mission. I came back to the States, and the general made me a chief warrant officer and took over my MOS for the world. And right afterwards, they came up with this desire to check out psychic functioning as a way of collecting intelligence. Normally, it would be, like a 3-year attempt to determine whether it was a threat. We'd spend a year maybe recruiting and training people to do whatever the supposed enemy, was doing. Possibly China and Russia. After that year, they would just turn us loose and we would target our own stuff, like the White House, the Pentagon, things like that. And then they'd take that material and send it to an independent agency that would review it and determine whether or not it was accurate or inaccurate, or what the accuracy level was, and whether or not it was a threat.
Operation Stargate went through many incarnations. And it began in 1972 at the Stanford Research Institute. And it's kind of an interesting history on Operation Stargate. The 2 individuals that were responsible for it were Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. They both had PhDs in physics. And then they hooked up with a psychic named Ingo Swann, and they were a little skeptical of Ingo's abilities. But then they had a well-shielded magnometer, and they put it in, they buried it 5 feet deep, and Swann was still able to manipulate that device. And then they thought to themselves, there's something going on here. What it is ain't exactly clear.
That's correct. What happened, he was actually asked to remote view it. And while he was remote viewing it, he had an effect on the device itself, the magnometer. So that really interested them. And that's what evolved into the development of remote viewing.
You were born in Miami in 1946 to a family of fairly humble means.
Yeah, I would say very humble.
It's kind of interesting going over your history. You seem to have, your aunt showed you a picture of you and your sister when you were infants, when you were 16 years old. And then you had these amazing memories of a surgery that you shouldn't have been able to remember. Was this the first glimmer of your abilities?
Yeah, I think so. I was flashing back to when I was around 5 or 6 years old, and I started having nightmares of people looking at me with their eyes, but their mouths and noses and everything were covered over. And it turned out that my parents informed me that I had had a major surgery when I was about 4 or 5 years old. I didn't recognize that. Of course, I had no memory of it except probably in my early teens. I started flashing back on that.
And after graduating from high school, you had attended Miami University with a partial scholarship for 1 day, and then you quit and joined the Army.
Right. Uh-huh. Couldn't stand it. It's too many people.
I spent a lot of time in academia, and I can empathize. And you were deployed in Vietnam in 1968 during the Tet Offensive, which wasn't one of the best times to be deployed in Vietnam, or probably the worst time to be deployed to Vietnam.
Yeah, actually, I got there in August of '67 and spent the entire year of the rest of '67 and almost all of '68 there. So yeah, I enjoyed 4 of the 5 major battles that they had while I was there.
And you had an ability to see disasters ahead of time when you were in the military. And I think is that when the Army first took note of you?
Yes, what I would do is I would be reading or something in the base camp, and I just get this funny feeling. So we get up and walk into the local bunker, and everybody would follow me in there, and it would turn out that I had pre saved myself from usually a mortar attack or something.
So you had this amazing ability that was discovered in Vietnam, and your senior officers thought you were either amazingly lucky, psychic, or a double agent. And what's kind of interesting, you were then in Germany and you got extremely food poisoned and had a near-death out-of-body experience, where you were actually hovering above your body as an ambulance drove you to the hospital and as the people at the hospital worked on you. What was that like?
Well, it was very scary for me because I got violently ill in the restaurant and didn't make it to the front door, just about. And they actually took me in a car to the clinic. It was about 38 kilometers away. And the reason they took me right to the clinic and didn't wait for an ambulance is because my heart stopped beating and they couldn't get it started again. So they rushed me to the clinic. I was comatose there for about 24 hours and then came back for some reason.
I myself have had one out-of-body experience, and it was very strange because I was hovering above myself.
Hmm.
And although I could look at myself, it was like it was a different person in a way. I knew it was me, but yet it just seemed like a different person. Did you have
Hmm.
that same experience?
Initially, when I first saw my body half in and half out of the restaurant door, I thought that was pretty strange. It looked familiar, but I wasn't absolutely sure it was me until I looked down and the water it was raining and the soft rain, and the water was passing through the palms of my hands. And then I knew that must be me, and I went over and it was. And it was scary because I thought, well, this must be what it's like to be dead.
So in 1973, Russell Targ, Hal Puthoff, and Ingo Swann got together and started what would become known as Operation or Project Stargate. And you write that you initially had no idea of your gifts in 1978, but you were interviewed at Fort Meade's what would become Project Stargate. And what happened at that point?
Well, what happened? The general called. I was an advisor to the commander of INSCOM at the time, the Intelligence Security Command. He called me in. General Roya called me in and said that he didn't know what this whole project was about, and he was nervous about it, and he wanted me to check it out to make sure it wasn't some hinky thing. So I went out to Stanford and started asking a lot of questions about it. And they suggested the best way to know what was going on would be to do one or two. So I actually did a series of 6 remote viewings and wound up with 5 first place matches and one very close to first place match. So by the time I got back to the headquarters, the general had assigned me to the project.
So with the remote viewing, did you write it like how it's done or how we see it done with like a pencil or a pen on a piece of paper? Or
Yeah, I asked them what am I supposed to do here, and they said, well, whatever pops in your head, put it down on paper. And that's all I did. I just drew it, put it down on paper.
and in 1978, you became Stargate's legendary Agent 001. And you were the first psychic to work directly for the Pentagon.
Right. I worked not only for the DOD, but for DIA, the FBI, CIA, NSA, uh, just about everybody you can think of. I think we're about 12 major intelligence agencies that I did work for over a period of 20 something years, actually longer than that.
So the next year, in 1979, the National Security Council wanted some help with an unidentified industrial building near the Arctic Circle in Russia. And you, through remote viewing, saw a very large submarine, which was later corroborated by photographs. Tell us, was that your first major breakthrough as a remote viewer?
That was my first, what you would call an intelligence first. They targeted the building because they had been doing so for, all these intelligence agencies have been targeting that building for a number of years and were unable to determine what was actually going on inside the building. So when I was targeted on the building, I didn't know that it was even a building that I was being targeted on because everything we did was done double blind. So I was taken into a room and they asked me to describe the target of interest in a sealed envelope. So I drew some things that I felt were going on inside whatever this big building was, and I had parts and pieces of submarine. And then it turned out when they asked more questions about why I was drawing the submarine, I said it was extremely large, 30 feet shy of the length of a Soviet aircraft carrier. It had a lot of upgrades like slanted missile tubes and many of the things they talked about in many years later in the Hunt for Red October movie. It turns out it was a brand new submarine. It was called the Typhoon. It eventually got the nickname Typhoon class submarine.
And then you spent essentially the next 17 years with the military doing remote viewing. And this is kind of interesting to me. In 1981, you discovered the location of a brigadier general named James Dozier after he had been kidnapped by the Red Brigade in Italy. How did that come about?
Well, it wasn't just me. There were 3 of us that actually came up with information on that project. There was a man by the name of Hartley Trent. He was a good friend of mine, and he was in the project, and he was able to describe some very detailed things about how he was being held and in what they were doing when they were holding him. He also was able to corroborate some of my drawings and sketches about the location of the building. I kept using the term Padua, and Padua is the archaic name for the same city that he had been kidnapped from. So they assumed they were holding him probably in the old part of the city, and that's where they were able to match up some of the details that we had of where he was being held to his actual location.
There's a number of remote viewing impasses that you had that are quite fascinating. Actually, Jimmy Carter gave you guys credit for finding a downed Russian jetliner. I thought that was
Actually, yeah,
over Africa.
that was a bomber that had just a Tu-122, I think, Bear bomber that had vanished, Russian bomber, vanished over Central Africa. I think it was Zaire, but I'm not sure now. But they had looked for that plane for a number of years and couldn't find it. And for obvious reasons, there were a lot of people looking for that plane.
It had a nuclear weapon on it, right?
I think so, yes. And that's a good reason to find it. But nobody could find it. And I was not directly involved in the actual locating of it, but I do know the three people that were, and they were in three diverse locations. They all put circles, very small, tiny circles on maps, identical maps, and all the circles interlocked. And it was within a few kilometers of where the plane actually was located. So President Carter was asked by one of his reporters in a briefing how he was able to finally find the plane, and he said, "We used our psychics," which caused us to get a name change and relocation and all of that.
So Jimmy outed the psychic spies.
Right, exactly. That started a lot of rumors that were hard to kill.
Is there another example that you can think of that you find to be pretty amazing?
Yeah, there were so many things that we were able to assist or aid in. What a lot of people mistaken about remote viewing is we don't develop it to the point that we can tell you exactly what it is, that sort of thing. Usually, it's about bits and pieces. Like if you need to know, there may be 3 entries that you have to use to rescue a hostage, and if you use the wrong entry, the hostage could be killed. And so we may give information like there's an overwhelming smell of a certain kind of flower or something by the entry, and that'll turn out to be the entry that they'll use, and it'll wind up being the one that was necessary to save the hostage. It's bits and pieces mostly that seem to bring more information together faster.
And why do you think that this ability exists? Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, this is a personal opinion. I think it's a very ancient capability that humankind has had for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. It's a survival mechanism. It's the reason why we're an animal with very short nails, no extra fur, that kind of thing, who've been able to survive hundreds of thousands of years against predators that should have eliminated us from the face of the planet. But it probably was the best thing we had for surviving prior to even being able to speak.
But as far as like the metaphysical ramifications of it, my thoughts on it are, I believe that everyone has psychic abilities to a certain degree, but some people just get more radio stations than others.
I believe that's true. Absolutely. Some spend their entire lives learning how to use it or apply it because of the types of employment they have or the things they're involved in, like police officers, firemen, even surgeons. Certainly the military and combat scenarios, but most of the people don't have that requirement. We're able to take the leisure route, check out things in books and libraries and stuff for our information for what we need the answers to.
The reason why I think we have this ability is I think, like Einstein, that everything is one. that there's an interconnectedness between all of us.
You can see that in the remote viewing, actually. Everything is interconnected. You can jump from describing a person at a target site to whether or not what school they went to when they were younger, how many kids they have, what their kids do for a living. Everything's wired together in like a huge matrix.
So how do you hone these abilities that you've developed?
Now, I'm asked that a lot. Unfortunately, there's not a magic pill. You have to practice it and practice it and practice it until you're so bored with it, your ego no longer gets in the way. And you're just able to put down whatever pops in your head without thinking about it.
So would you say that there's a spiritual attribute at work with remote viewing, that it has a...
Absolutely. You have to be able to defeat your personal ego drive. But the things that most people would do things for, self-aggrandizement or some kind of a feedback system that's a very positive one, that none of that works. You have to be willing to subject yourself to a lot of stress to produce answers for which you don't care whether or not you ever see, validation on. You just have to do it out of a sense of honor and understanding that it's going to help.
What's interesting is predicting the future. I believe that it's theoretically possible, almost theoretically possible, to predict the past, to jump ahead of the past. Like, I Love Lucy. Those waves have traveled, radio waves have traveled at the speed of light since the 1950s. And it's thought if you could resonate with an energy, kind of like a magnetic MRI, that if you could resonate with the energy of our reality, that you could go beyond that, beyond what our reality is emanating. But the thing is, the speed of light, you would have to go, according to what we know, at least with radio waves, you'd have to go beyond the speed of light, which Einstein said was impossible. But it just blows my mind that that you've predicted the future.
Well, the thing about predicting the future is it's far more difficult actually than reporting on the past. You can go pretty much anywhere you want to go in the past, and the reporting's easier because the conceptualizations that make what happened in the past possible, we have an understanding for all of those. And so understanding what you're seeing or what you're putting together in bits and pieces makes sense. But going into the future, you don't have to go too far in the future to be dealing with some issue that has never happened before. For instance, targeting, let's say, going 5 years ahead and targeting with the first time a pump laser drilled a hole through steel. Light beam cut its way through 4 inches of stainless steel or something. You wouldn't understand that. You could report on it, but everybody would think you were insane because you couldn't explain why or how it was happening.
It's interesting. You predicted the breakup of Skylab and essentially where it would fall to Earth in 1979. That blows me away. So you were seeing the future at that point.
I actually predicted that about 350 days before it actually happened. And the difficulty with it is I had the actual point of impact and the debris field going exactly the opposite direction of how it actually occurred. But the point of impact was exactly the same, which was the central northern deserts of Australia. It turns out that there was such a large object when it crashed on Earth. Its debris field was extremely long, thousands of kilometers long. So I did not understand that part, but I did have the general point of impact exactly where it happened.
So how did that happen? You were sitting at your table with a pencil and a piece of paper, and Did
Well,
you focus on Skylab, or did Skylab focus on you? I mean, how did that happen?
well, I asked the question, and the way I deal with time is I imagine a ruler in my head that's just a foot long. It's got little increments on it, like a 1 foot ruler, and there's a spread of light in the center, like a spike of light. And when I ask for the distance in time, it sort of spreads out along that ruler in the increments, and I have to just kind of translate those increments into years or distance or the measurement that I'm looking for an answer to. It's a guess, but I set it up in a way that the guess is occurring within a framework that I can use, that I can understand, versus just kind of winging it, trying to understand something that I shouldn't be able to. Um, I just get lucky sometimes, or however you want to view that. I'm just luckier 5 or 6 times more times than others. I run about 50 percentile, and where the average would be more like a 20 percentile.
What's interesting to me is predicting the future. Humans have free will, and we never quite know how that's going to play out generally. And although the human condition is filled with determinism, it does, as I said, it also has free will. So you would think that free will would be a major confounder as far as predicting the future, because the future would be fluid.
Well, yeah, it is. It actually is. But there's so many, everything occurs based on a series of decisions. And that series of decisions is in the hundreds or thousands. I mean, whether you go left or right, whether you say yes or no, whether you open a door or close a door, in the process of getting to an answer, everything changes every time you do that. So it's the iterations of change that decide whether or not you're going to be accurate. And so you may give a correct answer 20% of the time, but that would be what would be expected by chance. To increase that, you have to be able to assume answers that don't fit the parameters of chance. In other words, you go just a little bit beyond. The problem is people think that remote viewers are right all the time, and we're not. It's wrong, at least as many times as it's right. So deciding how to use something like remote viewing in a way that gives you a correcting factor. In other words, if you have perfect overhead pictures of the surface of the planet, you would target something underground by asking the remote viewer to draw everything they perceive in that area. And that means they would draw the surface as well as underground. And if you can then match the surface to the photographs and see that it's about 85% correct, you can assume that at the same time what they drew underground would be about 85% correct. So you just kind of try to play in some kind of features that give you a form of accuracy that might point to what will be better than not.
Well, Psychic Spies, you guys were given very difficult assignments that regular intelligence had a glimmer of, but had no idea of how it was going to penetrate that particular project.
You have to assume in the remote viewings that we did that there were many times when the answer was just totally spitballed out of nothing. I mean, we weren't even given hints on what the targets were. All of our targeting was in sealed, double wrapped, opaque envelopes. Nobody in the room with us when we did the remote viewings knew anything more about the target than we did. Even our monitors who would ask us questions based on what we were saying, sometimes they would ask exactly the right question, that would elicit the answer that everybody was looking for. So it's a process, and the process is one that seems to work very well in terms of drawing out this survival mechanism that would always keep humans alive in the ancient times. So we took this survival mechanism in the military and kind of tweaked it a little bit to give us real-time answers on problems today or in the future that we needed to address. And sometimes when it would work really well, it would work really well and it was obvious. Sometimes it just didn't work well. Sometimes it would fail.
So in these envelopes, was it primarily geographic locations, or was it a type of weapon?
When we first started, we were using geographic locations, and they were actually reading those locations to us in the open out to the second, degree, minute, second, east, west, north, south. And we would then report on what we were perceiving at that location. But I was accused by some intelligence agencies of having an eidetic memory and having memorized some of the most important GPS locations on the planet, which is ludicrous. Down to the second isn't even accurate. I mean, that's a 900 by 900 foot place on the ground, which could have 10 or 15 targets involved in it. So what we asked them to do was, well, if that's bothering you, just put it in a double wrapped opaque envelope and ask us to report on the location in the envelope, which they did, and it works just as well. We've even had occurrence when an agent would show up and say, oh my God, I left the target GPS locations in the envelope. I left them on my desk. And we'd say, okay, just write down target location in the envelope I left on my desk, report on that. And it works just as well. So there's something else operating there, like intent, expectation for outcome. I mean, there's just so many other ways of viewing this.
I knew a physician that was part of Stargate, and he said that remote viewers tend to be somewhat frail. Is that your experience?
I wouldn't say that. I would
Wouldn't?
say they're pretty darn hardy.
Okay.
Out of the original 6, there are 2 survivors, myself and a retired lieutenant colonel. He doesn't want his name exposed, so I don't talk about him. But the rest of the people died during the project. And I myself, after 20 years, after doing the remote viewing for 7 years and retiring from the military, within a year or so of retirement, I had 5 heart attacks and almost died. So I think it's the stress involved. If you're doing 5 remote viewings a day, 24/7 for some of the top intelligence agencies, and they're all life and death targets, the stress in that is just so enormous. It wears you down after a while. And until you're able to learn to deal with that kind of stress, it can do that. So I over the course of 44 years of doing this have learned to deal with the stress and the strain of having to deal with the life and death scenarios that I deal with. They're difficult sometimes, but you have to remember that it's not me having to survive that. It's some other person or some other unit that has to survive that. I just try to help them do that, to survive that in some way. I can't be responsible for it though.
So you think that stress does take a toll on remote viewers for sure?
Absolutely. It's the very reason why an agent in the field doesn't exist very long in the field. If you spend 5 years in the field, that's an enormous amount of time, active duty time in the field, without suffering from it in some way. So I would say that the agent who spends 10 years in the field or 15 years in the field doing an active mission is superhuman to some degree, has to be.
And you talk about that there are different levels of remote viewing.
Oh, yeah.
Could you delineate those for us?
Yeah, there's a number of levels of remote viewing. Like, for instance, when you first start remote viewing, you're predominantly producing gestalts. What gestalts are like, it's the summation of the target versus the details of the target. For instance, a bridge might be an overwhelming curve that does this sort of thing and is suspended over some object like a river or canyon or something, and you'll have repetitive metal parts, girding and stuff like that. You get those bits and pieces, and as soon as a more experienced remote viewer sees that, we can tell that this person's working on a bridge probably, or some kind of a construct, like a trestle or something like that. There are symbologies that occur initially in the remote viewing attempts to remote view, like inverted V's, crisscrosses of lines. If they're totally vertical and horizontal, that represents a fence or a blockage of some kind. If they're canted 45 to the left or right, it's usually a reflective surface, which you got to be careful of because a lot of things reflect light: concrete, steel, water, numerous things. Fog will even reflect light. So as you progress, there's stages where you're able to get deeper into the different processes and different things that you see or you perceive. The other part is remote viewing implies seeing something, and almost the entire time you're never seeing anything, you're perceiving something. So it has to do with taste, smell, thought, feeling, the possibility of tasting something, even. So if you go in with the idea that it's vision, usually vision takes away from all the rest of your senses. And so doing the remote viewing, you need to be paying attention to all of your senses. I test things by, in fact, tasting them.
And this ability that you have, how has it affected your spiritual beliefs?
Spiritually, it's affected me a great deal. Um, Almost everything that I've been most successful with requires a huge amount of empathy, empathy towards the target or towards the result. It usually has to do with either someone living or dying. It has to do with finding someone that's been kidnapped or abused, or maybe in the processes of dying. It has to do with perhaps an explosive device that's hidden somewhere. These are problems that have imperative answers that need to be done as soon as possible, or somebody's going to get hurt seriously by it. So the empathy you have for the numbers of people that might be hurt or involved kind of drives you to the answer faster. If you don't have a clear feeling of entropy or empathy for other human beings, you're not going to progress very far. But if you do, that sort of empathetic feeling that you have for other people gets more ingrained, more driven in terms of how and why you do what you do. I ordinarily would never have spent 44 years of my life doing anything, but I did with the remote viewing, even at the stress levels that it had, because I knew how much it was helping people.
And is that a common denominator with most of the psychic spies? Is a really heightened sense
It's a
of empathy?
very much so, to the point that if they're going to develop and become any good at what they do, that has to happen. There has to be a spiritual growth. I went to Russia after Perestroika and met many of my counterparts and had sit downs with like the deputy director of the KGB, ex-deputy director of the KGB, uh, with the three-star admiral who was running the Russian psychic program. They had 104 psychics, and I think some of the problems they experienced in their project dealt predominantly with the fact that their tendencies towards spirituality were either ignored or not seen in a favorable light. So they were unable to grow or progress in their abilities that they were trying to develop. It just a feeling I have from a personal standpoint. I think some of them understood it. I know a couple of their bosses understood it and had tremendous difficulty allowing the operation of their psychics on the one hand, while on the other hand, the administrative part was very difficult to deal with under the more authoritarian rule kind of situation.
Marxism doesn't really factor in spirituality and God. But the
Well,
Soviets nonetheless put a lot of money into their psychic spine.
yes, they do, and money isn't everything. Um, I would exchange money any day of the week to find a missing 5-year-old child alive that's been missing for a couple days. I would do anything in the world to save the life of someone who's been taken and is being tortured to death. I mean, you got to understand, these are things that touch me very deeply now, where maybe at the outset, being a soldier, I wasn't touched so deeply. So I've changed tremendously over the years as a human being.
I read somewhere that the Soviets actually put more money into remote viewing than the United States.
I think they did. I mean, they had 104 psychics. One of the requirements was their psychics had to be trained also in combat. So, like their top psychic was a woman. She was about 28 years old when I met her, and she had served in a mainline battle tank in Chechnya, the war in Chechnya, and had awards from that. So uh, she was a pretty hard charging person. When I first met her, she wouldn't come near me, wouldn't touch me, wouldn't shake my hand. But over time, when we did an experiment together in isolation chambers that were a half a mile apart, we did an experiment that worked really well. And after that, she seemed to be totally open to me and spent a lot of time kind of hanging out and talking to me and whatnot. Uh, Much of which I couldn't understand, unfortunately. But um,
The
she,
Soviets have
she
had regimes where if a psychic spy kept on getting wrong or kept on getting something wrong, they might be sent to Siberia. So there would probably be an impetus there.
well, you kind of you have to accept that in the fact that it isn't perfect. Uh, it's like any human endeavor. All human endeavors aren't perfect. So neither is the psychic spying. We had at least as good a result or better in many cases than the standard spy on the street, someone who would photograph something or collect intelligence on something. So that kind of accuracy is good enough, I will tell you, for aiding and assisting those agents in the street. That in fact the agents in the street liked us probably more than anybody else for the information that we were able to provide to them. The people at the extremely top, like in the Congress, in the Senate, in the different committees that were in charge of oversight for our project, they liked us a lot as well because of the enormous amount of money we were saving in producing that intelligence. It's the bureaucrats in the middle that gave us so many problems because we were threatening to some pretty high priced projects. Like the MX missile program was basically, we had a hand in killing that because we proved that you could determine where they were hiding nuclear weapons in look-alike storage containers. So that was a $5 billion project back then. And that did not set well with people when we were able to help kill that project to save that money.
The remote viewers, they often focused on domestic problems.
Domestic problems in that they were agency type problems, CIA problems, or dealt with internal threats from spies, that sort of thing. For instance, the newly constructed multi-story building in the embassy in Russia was never fully occupied because of us. We informed them just before the opening of the building that it was designed as basically a huge listening device, and we gave them locations to actually x-ray the walls and things, which they did, and it turned out that we were correct in many of our implications. So I don't think the building today is being used. So just so many things, so many ways you can be duped or miss something that it can be picked up very quickly by a remote viewer.
So you worked for Stargate for about 17 years.
Actually, I worked for it the entire time. I was the first one recruited as 001. And I worked when I left the Army in 84, I was hired by Stanford Research Institute International, the lab. When the lab left there and went to Science Applications International Corporation, I was let go at the Stanford lab and went to the SAIC lab. When the project closed in 1995, it closed the lab at SAIC, and I went to Laboratories for Fundamental Research in Palo Alto, cognitive science laboratory there. So I'm still working on remote viewing research. That entire time, about 42 to 44 years. I'm not sure exactly how long. I've provided information to numerous people and agencies that I work for years and years. So I will always respond to a national problem, and I always respond usually to missing children. It's become more difficult for me now since I'm 78 years old and have a lot of difficulty from my banged up body, my time in the Army. But I try to do what I can. But about 42 years, I provided support to just about anybody.
When you retired in 1984, you were awarded the Legion of Merit, which is
a
very
it's
high
almost never given to low-ranking warrant officers, or certainly not low-ranking enlisted or anything. But yeah, I was awarded the Legion of Merit. I don't know who wrote it, but the award came out of the Secretary of the Army's office, so it was a real surprise to me. I'm pretty proud of that award.
So in 1995, after Stargate and its various incarnations have been operational for 23 years, Bill Clinton says the program doesn't work and abolishes it. And you were quite outspoken about that.
Yes. In fact, the they, they closed it specifically because it didn't work, according to the CIA. The difficulty with that statement is they tasked us for 23 years. You don't keep coming back to the same restaurant eating the same food if the food's bad. So I question that. But secondly, I had at least 6 intelligence firsts of my own. That means no one else knew what I knew and reported that were significant intelligence operations. I would say that alone earns me the right to make those statements. And the fact that the Typhoon submarine, it was the first prototype ever built, a TK-089, and I reported on it, and I reported on almost the exact date it would be launched. So they were able to collect intelligence on it, and they built 8 more and never saw any of the other 8 or when they were launched or where they went. And today, the only one that survives is that TK-089. The others that were built cheaper, and I think they leaked radioactivity, and so they were decommissioned very quickly. But it was a devastating submarine. I mean, it carried 23 or 24 MER 5 missiles, so, and they were slanted, which was a direct improvement, which meant they could stand 100 miles off our coast and take out every major city in America in 20 minutes. I think that was a pretty important discovery in terms of remote viewing. So, there's just a lot of things like that that no one ever wants to talk about. The problem, the main issue, deals with the fact that I think that we were able to do this on a budget that didn't exceed $22 million over a 23-year period, 25-year period. That's peanuts. I mean, that's not even peanuts in terms of the budgeting in our government. And so it was a huge threat to other programs that cost hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, like single collection systems that are $250 million or more. I just think that it threatened too many developmental people across the planet in terms of our intelligence collection.
My theory on that is the government paid for Stargate for 23 years. And I've always
That's
thought
right.
it just went black. Do you think that there are still psychic spies out there and that the
No,
operation went black? We just thought,
no, I think they killed it entirely, and the reason why, um, it started in October of '78. By the time it reached July of '79, July, August, September, probably of '79, which is less than a year, um, they had tried to develop. They recognized that they needed a defense. They've tried to develop a defense against remote viewing from '79 until '95. I haven't seen a successful defense against remote viewing since. So if you can't, if it, I mean, it fails enough on its own that you can't rely on it 100%, but it does produce. So I think there was a decision made based on the fact that it doesn't work a lot of the times, and you can't tell when it might work and not work, that if they just ridiculed it, made it go away, that would be better than trying to perfect it in some way. I think it became a question of, can we defend against it? It's going to cost way more money to do the research to continue figuring out what's going on. It was just too big a problem from a governmental standpoint. I mean, we had senior senators pointing their fingers at us and tell us we were doing the work of the devil and we would burn in the fires of hell. I mean, come on. Had other senior senators telling us we were doing God's work. So, the lack of understanding for what was going on was horrendous. We were bad on one count and good on another, and had to justify everything. We had more oversight than any project in the history of the federal government. We had 5 oversight committees, everything from human use to whether or not we were violating religious principle or something. I don't know. It was just terrible, the whole experience. And that did a lot to bring even more stress on the remote viewers.
At one point, the CIA controlled Stargate, and then it was passed off to the military, but did the CIA still have a hand in it?
Actually, the CIA never did actually control it. They started with the interest in it. They only invested, I guess, $50,000 or 52,500 total in the very beginning. It was the military, the U.S. Army, that stepped in. INSCOM took an interest in it and decided to test it as a possible threat. The problem was that remember I talked about the 3 years that you use to test a threat? Well, we never got through those 3 years. We got through the first year, which was the recruitment. And then we started targeting our own stuff, and it worked so well that it scared everybody. And suddenly we got inundated with all kinds of problems that no one else could answer, like missing aircraft, strange things that happened to people in the field, events that they had no answers for. And we were answering those questions, and we were doing it within a day or two, when they had spent, in some cases, like that Tu-122 bomber, 2 years looking for it and couldn't find it, using all of everything that they had available. And we found it in literally hours. So it became an easy way to get something quickly that would meet the parameters of the type of intelligence they were looking for. And so we went right, instead of finishing the development of the possible threat scenario, it never got a full evaluation. It just went straight into collection. And we were buried with tasking. I mean, every agency in America started tasking us. The only one that stopped tasking us was the U.S. Air Force when we helped to kill the MX missile program, because they were the ones who were going to be managing it. When they lost that enormous amount of money in that new project, as a result, they cut us off completely. We didn't hear anything from the Air Force for 2 years. And then their chief of staff retired, and suddenly we were inundated by the Air Force again. So, it was okay to use us as long as people weren't looking. But if somebody found out that we were being used, then we became a weapon for destroying careers. So the whole thing was, being in it was a nightmare, to be honest. It was a career killer. I never saw a promotion board. In fact, my career manager at Department of Defense called me up and said, "I want to see you." And I went in and saw him. I thought maybe there was something wrong with my personnel file. And he said, "I just wanted to tell you to your face, if I can, I'm going to run you out of my army
Huh?
because I don't like what you're doing. That's my career manager.
That's not very supportive.
No, no one was very supportive.
And what's your life like today?
On my life today,
Yeah.
it's okay. I'm fine. I have a lot of problems with pain. I have a lot of problems with what happened to me overseas. I got busted up pretty good in the army, but that's okay. I did my job. I always did my job. I had an active mission the entire time I was in the army, 20 years. Uh, there's a number of people who have said that I didn't like the army. No, that's not true. I love the army. I would do 30 years if I could. I just couldn't do it. My 20 years of active missions was enough to just wear you down. Um, no, I love the army the whole time I was there, and in terms of my involvement in the remote viewing project, 42 years says a lot about how much I would support it. I'm not sure I would do the same thing a second time. I told the general when the general assigned me to Fort Meade to the unit before I was recruited. I was first guy recruited. When he assigned me there, I asked him not to do it because I knew it was a career killer. And he said, "No, I need somebody that can watch my six, that can tell me if something's going south on the project." And so I agreed to do it. Agreed. He ordered it, and I said, "Yes, sir." So um, I'd still do it under orders, but I'm not sure I would do it voluntarily.
But you did help. You've helped a lot of people with
Yeah,
your ability.
yeah. I can't complain. Hey, I got involved, and once you get involved in this and you see it working, and you're able to produce information that can't be discovered or produced any other way, the times it works is incredible. The times it fails are incredible. But you got to take that with the successes. Just that most people, if they got caught dead standing next to one of us, their careers were over. So why would they? You know, um, Secretary of Defense didn't like me at all because he knew that if he had anything to do with me, his career would be over politically.
So they were afraid of the psychic spies mojo.
Yeah, well, not the mojo. It had to do with if you're caught dead standing next to a psychic spy, your career's over politically. It could be used as a weapon against you. Oh, look at him. He uses psychics. I use regular intelligence. He uses psychics, for God's sake. He's dangerous. Career's over. That kind of thing.
Joe, I
And
really
yet,
want. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, and yet in combat, the point guy who keeps you alive more than anyone else, he's psychic. I guarantee you, if he's good at it, he's psychic.
Well, thank you for coming on the Nick Bryant podcast.
No, you're welcome. I was glad to be here.
It's been a very edifying conversation, and have yourself a great night, Joe.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it, Nick. You have a good future.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Coming from a psychic spy, I very much thank you.
Uh,
Take care.
thanks.